He rode into Naples crowned with hope. He left it barefoot, bloodied, and headless before the mob. Conradin of Swabia was the last heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a child born into legacy, war, and doom. At just 16, he marched into Italy to reclaim a throne stolen by papal decree. What followed was not a noble martyrdom, but a methodical destruction, body, dignity, and name, in the sunlit piazza of Naples. The sun that hangs over Lombardy in late summer is not the benevolent disc painted in gospel margins but a swollen, merciless coin. It presses against Conradin's bare nape through the gap in his helm until the skin blisters and peels, and every jolt of the saddle grinds iron rim against raw flesh, leaving a crescent of yellow-white pus that oozes into the padded collar meant to guard his spine. The boy, no taller than the sword carried for him by a squire already grey with ague, rides at the head of an army whose banners have faded from crimson to the dull maroon of dried liver. Behind him trail pikemen coughing black sputum, Norman mercenaries whose ankles seep lymph through rotting leather, and German knights picking at the lice that tunnel beneath the quilting of their hauberks. Each milestone southward seems to exhale contagion. In the Pomarsches the horses' hooves churn up clouds of mosquitoes that settle on eyelids and lips, leaving bright pearls of blood. In the Apennine passes the night air reeks of wet stone and goat dung, so cold it needles the lungs, yet the men sweat as though gripped by midsummer fever, their breath fogging in uneven gasps that smell of wine gone sour and the coppery tang of early infection. Papal edicts nailed to crossroads hiss against the wind, Conradin, false king, anathematized, and peasants reading them kneel in rutted earth, making hurried signs of the cross as the procession clatters past, for superstition insists that to meet the gaze of an excommunicate prince is to invite plague upon one's cattle and madness upon one's firstborn. At dusk outside Siena, Conradin pauses to drink from a leather flask. The water is warm, carrying the faint taste of mule dung, and as he swallows he feels the delicate skin at the corner of his mouth split, dribbling a thread of red that the torchlight makes gleam like lacquered cinnabar. His thoughts, once bright with tournament dreams, now circle a single image, an altar scene in childhood, Christ's neck bent under a murderous sky, the sculptor having carved a vein so precisely that even in marble it seems to throb. Is my own vein as narrow, as breakable? The notion returns hourly, each time his pulse bangs against his temples like fists on a barred gate. When the column reaches the coastal plains of Lazio, nights become sleepless vigils. Wind shudders through the camp, rattling shields. Somewhere in the dark a lad delirious with quartan fever shrieks that St. Michael stands above the tents with a flaming sword, its heat blistering the stars. Officers mutter that the boy king is cursed. A Neapolitan arbalester swears he saw crows perched on Conradin's standard at dawn, their beaks tapping the Hohenstaufen eagle as if tasting carrion in advance. The rumor spreads faster than fever. God himself has weighed the orphan crown and found it empty. On the final march toward the Straits of Messina, armor no longer fits the prince's thinning shoulders. Every rivet seems to vibrate with a prophetic clamor, and the chafe at his ribs has worn a coin-sized ulcer that weeps clear fluid down his side, sticky against the linen. Still, he rides upright, gray eyes fixed on a horizon already bruised by fire from villages torched in papal warning, and the smell, charred wheat, scorched meat, wet ashes, slips under his visor, crawling down his throat until each breath feels half smoke, half prayer. Somewhere beneath the clang of hooves and the groan of wagon axles, Conradin imagines he can hear stones whisper, one to another, passing along the road's length the secret of his ordained demise. The child comes, sharpen the axe, cool the block, prepare the square. The sound is faint, yet it drowns even the trumpets, and by the time the army descends toward Sicilian soil, the boy who left Bavaria has been scoured away. What remains is a stripling effigy, sun-cracked, fever-scented, already shadowed by the scaffold he cannot yet see, but whose weight he feels in every trembling beat of his blood. The dawn over the plain of Tagliacozzo begins as a smear of copper against the Abruzzi peaks, yet within minutes the light is swallowed by a rising fog of pulverized earth and horse sweat, so thick that banners vanish and the sun itself seems to bleed into the dust. Somewhere inside the choking cloud Conradin hears the first armor plate split like rotten bark, and when the veil parts he beholds his cousin Frederick, the last familiar face in a host of hired blades, pivot beneath a French mace. The gilded crest of Swabia caving in with a wet, hollow clap that turns the prince's brain to gruel before his body even understands it has died. Trumpets squeal, not with the clean chivalric notes of tournament but with the cracked anguish of metal horns drowned in terror, and the boy king's charger, maddened by impact and the stench of ruptured bowels, rears so violently that its belly is speared by an Anjou lance. The animal's scream is high and human, a single shrill line that saws through bone and nerve before the collapsing half-ton of flesh drives Conradin into the trampled reeds beside the Salto River, where hoofs churn armor. limbs, and viscera into a broth that steams under August heat like offal in a butcher's trough. Pinned beneath the flailing carcass, he feels the quilted gambeson soak first with horse blood, then his own, as a splintered stirrup leather slices his inner thigh, a shallow wound, mere inches long, yet the exposed flesh puckers around an iron shaving that glitters inside him like a tiny, malicious tooth. Each heartbeat pumps a fresh ribbon of warmth down his calf until the boot squelches, and with every pulse he thinks of sin-blackened angels chiseling tally marks onto his spine, counting down to an end he still believes he might outride if only the sky would clear. Instead the sky darkens, a cavalry wedge of Charles of Anjou crashes through the Swabian flank, their destriers draped in blue cloth stamped with lilies that are now lacquered brown by other men's lungs. One knight reins in, peers at the child pinned under the steaming horse, and for a breath Conradin expects mercy, some chivalric echo of Pentecost vows, yet the visor stays shut. The sword comes down not to free him but to sever the charger's hamstring, ensuring the beast dies faster so the column can roll on, leaving the half-buried boy to drown in its wake of mud, ordure, and pulverized bone dust that tastes like ground Eucharist mixed with rust. Hours, or eternities, later, mercenaries from Catalonia wrench him free, cursing the weight of his mail as they drag him across a gravel bank alive with tadpoles and congealing blood. They strip the ruined boots, exposing feet blistered to weeping slough, and bind his wrists with hemp that smells of salt and old urine, all while debating in bored murmurs how rich the bounty will be for a heretic prince whose excommunication scrolls already flutter on every church door from Piacenza to Palermo. A priest in their company, cross crudely inked on his surcoat, bends close enough for Conradin to smell the sour wine on his breath, whispers that God has bitten the boy with the first fong of hell and the next will come in Naples, then presses a scrap of cloth to the thigh wound, not to heal it but to stanch the bleeding only so far as ransom demands a living victim. Before scrawling a sigil of the Archangel Michael in the grime upon the child's brow, a mock benediction meant to ward off the devil he insists now nests in Hohenstaufen flesh. Silent, lips colorless from shock and fever, Conradin stares at that sliver of iron lodged beneath the skin, shining like a relic shard of some unhallowed lance, and wonders, without words, because the world has become a roar of hooves, chains, and mocking hymns, whether the metal inside his body will rust before the blade at Naples finds his neck. As the convoy jerks southward, every jolt drives the fragment deeper, a private augury of the public steel to come. And the boy king, barefoot in swamp-stained linen, at last understands that the battlefield has not devoured him whole, it has merely broken the first layer of bone so judgment can seep in like rot through a splintered door. Salt wind, sharp as ground glass and rank with rotting kelp, scrapes through the arrow slits of the sea fortress and settles over the cell like invisible mildew, so that every breath Conradin draws tastes of brine, iron, and an undernote of human ordure fermenting in the cracks of the flagstones where older prisoners have wept, bled, and been forgotten. The boy king enters barefoot, wrists already ringed by iron manacles whose edges bite deeper each time he shivers, his mail stripped away in the courtyard so quickly that a patch of sun-blistered skin is flayed clean off his collarbone, leaving a sticky oval that adheres to the coarse wool of the fetid tunic they throw across his shoulders as though dressing a corpse for burial. The jailer's torches gutter out once the door slams, abandoning him to darkness broken only by a sliver of moonlight that drips through a barred slit high in the wall, an anemic blade of silver that sketches his shackles in trembling lines and makes the chain links gleam like wet teeth gnawing his ankles raw. Each time the tide slaps the outer rampart, the floor trembles, and the stagnant puddles in the corners stir, releasing a sour stink of fish rot that mingles with the ammonia fumes rising from the bucket shoved at him as a latrine. By the second night, the mixture curdles in his throat until he coughs strings of blood that spatter the stone with tiny black rosettes, seeding the slick surface for the rats to lap. The thigh wound from Tagliacozzo has festered, under the crusted poultice of dried mud, pus percolates in warm pulses, and when he shifts his weight the scab splits, weeping a saffron jelly that trickles down the inside of his leg to pool at his heel, where it steams faintly in the chill. He feels the infection climbing like ivy toward his groin, every heartbeat a hammerstroke, every hammerstroke an annunciation of rot, yet the sentries who slide the morning ration through the hatch neither look at the wound nor offer a poultice. They toss him a fist-sized lump of yesterday's bread steeped in vinegar, the crust crawling with green spores, while wagering coin on whether the serpent of Swabia will last a week or two before gangrene stifles his royal pretensions. When hunger overcomes revulsion he gnaws until the vinegar razors down his cracked lips into the fissures of his tongue, and almost at once his stomach revolts, convulsing him onto all fours where he retches sour foam into a corner already alive with sleek, fearless rats, the largest perches on its haunches, whiskers twitching, tiny black eyes fixed on the pale thread of vomit sliding toward it as though the creature recognizes the lineage of emperors reduced to broth for its supper. Nights stretch, elastic and malignant, until they feel unmoored from God's calendar. Fever hoists him onto a barbed wire of half-sleep where visions drip like candle grease. His mother standing on a Bavarian balcony, face veiled not by morning lace but by crows whose claws hook her eyelids. St. John the Baptist striding through seawater that rises to the saint's knees and boils, turning skin to scrolls of parchment. A headless Christ bending to kiss Conradin's mutilated thigh and whispering that every king must learn the taste of his own decay. He wakes from these phantoms gagging on the sour stench of his own sweat, lymph crusted in his armpits like resin, hair once gold now a snarled mat peppered with white egg sacs that burst between his nails when he scratches. The only daylight visitors are soldiers in Anjou livery, swaggering in 2 by 2 to measure his neck, first with a hemp cord, then with a strip of thin parchment they notch and label column heretici, while recounting, loud enough for echoes to carry, how beautifully Neapolitan crowds cheer when foreign princes bleed. One, younger than Conradin, crosses himself after touching the boy's fever-hot skin, muttering that the chill seeping from these walls is not sea breath but purgatory exhaling. Another rubs the notched stick against the cell door for luck, as if the wood might drink in royal misery and yield him promotion. Their laughter sticks to the air like candle soot long after they leave. In the deepest watches before dawn, when the surf booms like distant cannon and the moonbeam shrinks into a single trembling nail of light, Conradin hears his chains rasp in time with his heartbeat, and the rhythm becomes a question he cannot silence. How many pounds of flesh must a dynasty weigh to balance one adolescent throat? But he has no breath left for answers, only the cough answers, rattling, deeper each hour, until it sounds less like a human chest and more like the grinding hinge of the executioner's blade, already testing its sweep in dreams beyond the barred slit where sky, indifferent and pale, awaits the morning that will come, wash the fortress stones, and find the boy king one sunrise closer to a block still cooling in the Neapolitan square. The doors of the Castel Capuano burst inward on a blast of damp November air, and Conradin, shackled wrist to ankle, is hauled across the threshold like a netted animal still half alive, his bare soles slapping the marble in sluggish, meaty echoes that smear a trail of pus and saltwater over the inlaid lilies of Anjou. Each step tears at the raw hoops of flesh that swell above the fetters, and by the time the guards wrench him upright before the dais, thin crescents of skin dangle from the iron, like ragged parchment ribbons fluttering in a stagnant chapel draught. Above him, Charles of Anjou reclines on a throne polished to funeral mirror brilliance, gilt catching the torchlight so cruelly that each facet seems to wink in silent derision at the boy's rotting tunic, its hem stiff with vomit and seawater grime. The king's wine-dark mantle pools around the dais, a swirl of velvet so immaculate it makes Conradin's own ribs, protruding through moth-gnawed wool, appear not merely starved but somehow blasphemous, as though hunger itself were treason against such curated splendor. No advocate is summoned, no parchment read beyond the terse recital of charges already etched into every church porch from Toulouse to Trastevere: excommunicate, rebel, regicide in wish if not in deed. And as the papal legate intones the litany, incense is burned not to sanctify the hall but to mask the odor uncoiling from the prisoner, the sour-sweet perfume of infected thigh, the ammoniac tang of stressure and drying in cracked fabric, the faint, metallic breath of a mouth that has eaten nothing but vinegar crusts for 20 nights. Conradin tries to anchor his gaze on a crucifix hanging behind the throne, yet the candlelight makes the painted Christ shimmer, the wounds appear wet, and for one vertiginous instant he thinks the eyes tilt downward, pitying or accusing, he cannot tell, before the vision slides away in a fever shimmer and leaves only wood gone slick with age-black varnish. His knees buckle, first one, then the other, but he does not fall, instead he remains half-crouched, the chains singing against marble, a grotesque parody of nightly genuflection that draws a hiss of amusement from courtiers robed in silk the color of old wounds. The sentence, death by sword in the market square, is delivered in a voice as smooth and bloodless as an ivory comb, and in the hush that follows Conradin feels, rather than hears, the spectators press closer, the rasp of their brocade sleeves sounding like rats scrabbling under a coffin lid. Somewhere a woman mutters a prayer too swiftly to be devotional, more charm than supplication, and a priest beside her pinches the bridge of his nose as though warding off contagion carried on the prisoners' very breath. When the guards gesture for final words, the boy's lips, rimmed in rusted fissures, tremble but do not fail. He gathers a breath that tastes of copper gutter water and whispers Pater, in manus tuas, Father, into thy hands, the old Latin flowing ragged yet unbroken, each syllable escorted into the vaulted gloom by a thread of blood that creeps from the corner of his mouth and beads beneath his chin like a single crimson rosary. The echo rings through the hall, thin and chill. And something in it, perhaps the steadiness, perhaps the unmistakable timbre of a child still clinging to liturgy, makes even seasoned captains avert their gaze, as though daylight had pierced mortar and illuminated the maggots feasting beneath courtly pomp. Outside, no trumpets blare, the milling crowd, pressed against a barricade of pikes, quiets into an uneasy murmur that rises and falls like a nervous tide, for they sense that in witnessing a boy king condemned without plea they have trespassed into a space older than law, a chamber where dynasties are not judged but sacrificed, and the scraping of chains along marble is the creak of some ancient hinge swinging wide to admit pestilence and retribution. Morning light, pale as unskimmed milk yet pitiless in its clarity, spills over the Piazza del Mercato, painting every cobble, stall awning, and poultry cage with a hard brilliance that makes even the flies shimmer. At the center, roped off by pikemen whose spearheads still glisten with the oil of last night's sharpening, rises a low oaken platform blackened by old weather and older blood, its chopping block nicked into the shape of a crescent moon by decades of blows that never quite fell true. Through a corridor of soldiery Conradin is marched, or rather towed, for the chains at his wrists drag his shoulders low and force a stuttering half-crawl that leaves faint crescents of watery red on the stones where swollen feet burst under their own weight, while the crowd, thousands thick, compresses itself into silence so dense that a bread seller's coin dropped 2 alleys away rings like the crack of a monstrance. Mothers clutch children's faces into skirts, fishwives mutter Ave Marias half remembered, and gamblers who came to wager whether the prince would faint now stare at their dice with sudden shame, as though the ivory had sprouted eyes. The boy wears only a torn linen shirt, stiff with dried sweat and the brown lacework of fever weepings, and because someone in the palace barbered him with sheep shears the night before, his hair hangs in jagged tufts that reveal the fragile hollows behind his ears, pale, bruised, already trembling, so that every breeze feels like a knife exploring the skin where a coronet once pressed. He is crownless, shoeless, prayerless, for no priest has been allowed to walk beside him lest absolution diminish the spectacle, and thus the hush that greets his arrival carries not homage but a collective flinch, the instinctive recoil a city makes when it realizes the gods might be looking back. On the scaffold the smell of pitch, laid to keep the planks from splitting, mingles with the copper tang rising off the executioner's sword, an ungainly thing whose edge warps slightly where earlier victims chipped it, yet the man wielding it shakes more than the condemned, sweat beading at his tonsured hairline as if he alone hears the psalms whispered by women in the front rank begging the archangel Michael to close heaven's gate against the heretic's soul. Conradin, throat raw from 2 nights without water, forces air past lips that bleed anew simply by moving, and in a voice cracked but unwavering offers forgiveness to all who wrong me, knowing or unknowing, the Latin syllables rattling against his fetters like small bells tolling in reverse. When he kneels, the linen stretches across his shoulder blades and bursts at a seam, exposing the pale triangle of a boy's scapula right where a man's mantle would fasten. The executioner lifts the blade, pauses, perhaps praying, perhaps calculating, and swings, but the edge glances off damp fabric and bites into the flesh above the collarbone, sending a fan of bright droplets across the block-scarred grain. Conradin's scream, high and startled, ricochets off market stalls and makes a vendor drop a string of sausages that slap the dust like severed entrails, yet no one laughs, for the sound is too unroyal, too childlike, too horribly near. The second stroke comes quicker, cleaving deep enough to lay open windpipe and gristle yet stopping at the knot of youthful vertebrae, so that the body convulses in a spasmodic bow, spraying a mist that freckles the hangman's apron and drives a pregnant woman to faint where she stands. Her collapse punctuated by the dry heave of a soldier who has seen war but never the slow unthreading of a throat. Only on the third swing, desperate, two-handed, almost relinquishing control, does steel find the gap, and the head, lighter than anyone expects, rolls forward until it settles face down near a puddle that reflects the sky like a tarnished mirror, the lips still flickering in a final reflex that some swear forms the word mater. No cheer breaks the silence, instead a single gull shrieks overhead, and in that thin, ragged cry the multitude hears an echo of something ancient snapping, perhaps the line of Hohenstaufen blood, perhaps the last filament binding justice to mercy, so they stand motionless while the corpse is bundled away, shoulders hunched as if expecting the air itself to darken, and only when the hangman, gray-faced, retches onto his own boots does the first murmur rise, not triumphant but uneasy, the sound of citizens discovering that the price of seeing a boy die is the lingering taste of iron in every breath they draw for the rest of their numbered days. Night creeps over Naples not as velvet, but as a smear of coal dust that clings to the lungs, and beneath this throttled sky 6 soldiers drag what was once Conradin, now a slack bundle of disjointed limbs bound with rope still wet from the rinse of public hoses, down the narrow passage behind the Church of the Carmine, where the earth has been clawed open into a trough as featureless as a butcher's gutter. The corpse, already stiffening, lands with a muffled crack, its severed neck knocking stoned so that a final globule of dark post-mortem blood beads like tar on the boy's clavicle before soaking into the soil. No priest recites committal, no censer swings, instead the captain orders salt, coarse Adriatic crystals kept for curing hog carcasses, poured over the body until its young skin gleams beneath a wet frost of preservation that is, in truth, desecration, for the grains bite into drying flesh with a hiss like parchment singeing, and anyone close enough can hear the faint crepitation of muscle fibers shrinking under chemical scorn. To keep night dogs from sniffing royalty, they shovel 2 spadefuls of quicklime across the chest, the lime blooms white heat, feathering steam that smells of vinegar and singed feathers, curling the torn linen inward as if the corpse were trying, too late, to wrap itself in modesty. 2 hours later, in the barracks yard, Conradin's shredded shirt, his lice-riddled hair shavings, and the strip of cloth that once bound his thigh are heaped atop a brazier whose coals pulse like infected gums. The fire takes quickly, turning royal sweat and adolescent blood into a ribbon of greasy smoke that twists up the alley, over guttering lanterns, until it escapes into the Neapolitan dark where bats will like errant prayers. A corporal, superstitious even for a soldier of Charles of Anjou, orders the ashes swept into a clay bowl. He tips them into the city sewer where turbid water gulps the grey residue, carrying it beneath butcher stalls, sailors' brothels, and finally into the Tyrrhenian Sea, so that by dawn not even a smell remains to remind the market of what it demanded. Yet the purge of matter cannot cauterize memory. Before sunrise, papal riders gallop through Campania, tacking decrees that brand every knight, squire, and page who once raised the Hohenstaufen eagle a traitor fit for pyre or rope. Doorways splatter with lamb's blood where families attempt warding charms, and more than one widow hides a son beneath wine barrels, whispering that angels will blind the inquisitors if faith is true. In Rome, the legate composes a letter describing divine justice consummated, signing the parchment with a flourish that masks the tremor in his knuckles, for he, too, heard the ragged cry when the executioner's blade first slipped and suspects heaven flinched. Meanwhile, in Naples, market women crossing the now-washed square feel an icy thread slide beneath their kerchiefs, and without knowing why they draw the sign of the cross twice, once upright, once reversed, to close whatever invisible wound hangs in the air. Children dare each other to peer into the alley behind the Carmine, swearing they have seen a pale figure, barefoot, neck crimson and glistening as though perpetually new-cut, pacing the cobbles and searching, always searching, for a lost steel shimmer. They say if you meet those gray eyes and do not avert your own, you will hear a boy's voice, hoarse, salt-scorched, asking whether you have seen his sword, and that the question smells of lime and sea rot, and that if you fail to answer, the next wind that blows inland will carry the taste of blood over every loaf baked that day. So the city moves forward, market bells ringing true, but under each clang thrums a softer note, uneasy, persistent, a memory etched not in marble or chronicle but in the metallic aftertaste that lingers on every tongue, a warning that kings may perish, yet the echo of injustice walks, barefoot and head bowed, through alleys where salt cannot blind and ash cannot bury the most restless part of a murdered crown. Conradin's death marked the definitive end of the Hohenstaufen line, the imperial bloodline extinguished by steel and papal decree. Charles of Anjou ruled Naples with cruelty and fear, but his crown remained stained by the murder of a boy. In Germany, the nobility mourned but did not rebel. Yet across Europe, the legend of Conradin grew, not as a king, but as a sacrificial lamb, a child butchered for politics, whose ghost was never granted peace.